exploring how we can master ourselves by looking at how authors and experts say it is possible, with your host, Shashiti Basu. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 84 of How to Be, with me, Shashiti, as your timid presenter, guiding you through life's tricky topics and skills by reading through the best books out there. Patriarchy is a socially constructed system where males have primary power. It affects many aspects of life, from political leadership, business management, religious institutions, economic systems, and property ownership, right down to the family home, where men are considered to be the head of the household. There is no question that we still live in a patriarchal system, because not only is the gender inequity still so stark, despite laws to the contrary, but the dominance hierarchy aspect is in near full effect. So what exactly is patriarchy, and how do we move past this oppressive system? Here is Jenifer Joy, who is an artist, model, educator, performer, musician, and all-round professional unicorn on her thoughts.
The patriarchy to me seems to be kind of like this anonymous, rigid system of like no's, or things that only if you X, Y, Z, then you A, B, C. And sometimes those rules are either clear or not clear, fair or unfair, contradictory or not. And so how I experience the patriarchy, interestingly enough, all of my income has always been paid by a male, whether I'm in a specific job or I'm working with a client or hired somewhere. I find it interesting that in all time, I've never been hired and paid by a female. Why is that? So that's my thought.
Our first book is from Angela Saini, who is an award-winning science journalist and author of books Superior, The Return of Race Science, and Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong, which are both on university reading lists across the world. She presents radio and television programs, and her writing has appeared across the world, including in the Financial Times, Wired, New Scientist, and National Geographic. She is a 2022 Logan Nonfiction Fellow and part of the Humboldt Residency Program in Berlin. In 2020, Saini was named one of the world's top 50 thinkers by Prospect magazine, and in 2018, she was voted one of the most respected journalists in the UK. We're talking about her new book, The Patriarchs, How Men Came to Rule. It was an absolute pleasure to speak to her, hence here is a snippet of our chat, but find the full interview on www.howtobe247.com or on the YouTube channel.
It's not as though people haven't looked at this question. It was a very popular question in the middle of the 19th century, which is why philosophers and anthropologists were looking at it. And it became interesting again in the 1970s and 1980s with the next wave of feminism, as people were really trying to interrogate how did we get to here and what are the real reasons that women are oppressed. And then it kind of petered away. So the last big book on this topic was Gerda Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy, which is about as old as I am. So, more than 40 years. And that really goes to show you just how much we've naturalized this question. We just assume that things have always been this way, or that there's some inevitability about it, that this doesn't have a history in the same way as other forms of repression. And I really wanted to challenge that. I wanted to look behind that and look at the evidence that we have. And I don't leave aside the possibility that maybe there are biological factors that, might make men aggressive or make them want to rule. But if that's all you have, if your only real argument is that this is just natural, how fatalistic is that? And also it flies in the face of all the historical evidence we have of egalitarian societies, huge amount of social variation in how people live through space and time. So right across the world, and especially the further back you go into prehistory, we don't see very good evidence of men and women living different lives, or of women, doing completely different things from men. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, how natural is it really? Is it something that has been around forever, or is it a product of our own cultures and politics and societies? And there is a very clear history to be painted there. And that's what I wanted to give to people, was that history. We kind of exceptionalize gender depression. We know that race is a social construct, that racial injustice is something that we have created and that we can uncreate. The same with class oppression. We know that we don't, treat those in the lowest socioeconomic groups, even as a result of intergenerational poverty, as somehow biologically different from everybody else. So why would we treat women's oppression that way? We really do resign ourselves to it sometimes. And even sometimes when I read feminist literature, there is this assumption that when we fight for equality, we're doing something that nobody has ever done before, that we are reversing the natural grain of who we are. We're imposing something on us as a species that hasn't been done before. And nothing could be further from the truth. Like I said, the further back you go into prehistory, the more you see very egalitarian societies that weren't particularly gendered. I mean, one of the first places I visited when I was writing The Patriarchs was Çatalhöyük, which is this very ancient 9,000-year-old at least settlement in southern Anatolia. So this is in modern day Turkey. And, this predates the pyramids. It predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. Predates writing, and every measure we have of inequality using archaeological methods tells us that this was not a particularly gendered place. Men and women didn't do different things. They weren't buried in different ways. They didn't eat different food. They didn't spend different amount of time indoors or outdoors. And women were very visible. You see female figurines everywhere from that time period. So we really have to ask ourselves then, when did things change and how? I'm a huge science fiction fan, a bit of a geek that way, I always have been. And often, this is true not just of the Planet of the Apes. The weird thing about the Planet of the Apes, and it's been critiqued from lots of different angles, not least the racial angle, but not so often from the gender angle. Here is a society in which everything is starting again with different species. So it's not humans starting again, it's other species starting again. And yet, they end up, again, being male-dominated. Almost all the primate characters that you see in the Planet of the Apes, at least the protagonists, tend to be male. And we don't question that. We just treat it as though this is the kind of universal rule in the animal kingdom. And of course, it's not. The two closest species to us genetically, the two primates, chimpanzees and bonobos. Chimpanzees are male-dominated, fine. Bonobos are female-dominated, they're matriarchal, so there's no reason to assume that if other primates were to begin society again, start all over from scratch, that they would be necessarily patriarchal, that they would follow exactly the same rules that we have followed. And through examples like that, I really want to challenge our assumptions and just ask, why is it that we don't question this more? Why is it, for example, in Star Trek, which is pretty progressive as a series, and I've watched every single episode of Star Trek ever made, possibly twice or three times. But every single time I'm surprised at how often we still treat female power as exceptional. So, for example, there's one episode in which, this is one of the older ones in I can't remember which series it is, but it's one of the older ones, in which the crew land on a planet in which the women are in charge. And this is clearly a puzzle to the crew. Why are the women in charge? And the way they kind of frame that is that the women on this planet tend to be a bit bigger and more muscular than the men, who are a bit smaller. And what does that tell us? That tells us that we assume that our own species is male-dominated because of the size difference between us, when in fact, there is no reason to assume that. Because, for example, like I said, among bonobos, the males are slightly larger than the females, but the females are still in charge.
In her book, The Patriarchs, Saini sets out to explore the history of patriarchy and its impact on society. She begins by tracing the origins of patriarchy to the earliest human societies, and then goes on to examine how it has evolved over time. People have long struggled to understand the origins of patriarchy. Saini writes that in 1680, the English political theorist Sir Robert Filmer defended the divine rights of kings by arguing in his Patriarcha that the state was like a family, meaning kings were effectively the fathers and the subjects the children. The royal head of state was the ultimate earthly patriarch, ordained by God, whose authority went back to the patriarchs of the biblical times. In Filmer's vision of the universe, an obviously self-serving one for an aristocrat, patriarchy was natural. It began small, in people's families, with the father having dominion over his household, and ended large, marbled through institutions of politics, law, and religion. Hundreds of years later, there was still something compelling about Robert Filmer's fractal-like explanation. In Sexual Politics, a classic feminist text of 1970, the American activist Kate Millett defined patriarchy as the control of younger men by older men, as well as the control of women by men more generally. Starting with the father, gendered power was still thought to radiate outwards from the home to the community and the state. But there remained the question of how men came to have that power in the first place. Hence, Saini argues that gendered oppression was cooked up and refined not only within societies, it was also deliberately exported to others for centuries through proselytism and colonialism, and that the discourse can be convoluted. She says that after centuries of living in the societies we have made, we call what we see patriarchy. From here, it appears almost conspiratorial, as though it was cleverly planned out from the start, when in truth, it has always been a slow grift, which continues today. From the Taliban's resurgence in Afghanistan to the overturning of abortion rights in the US, this isn't a done and dusted origin story. It's one that we're actively in the process of writing. Saini argues that patriarchy is not a natural or inevitable part of human society, but rather a social construct that has been created and maintained by men. She brings up the Hollywood blockbuster movie Planet of the Apes, as we talked about, a dystopian fantasy adapted from the 1963 work of the French novelist and former secret agent Pierre Boulle. For those of you who have never seen it, it's about unsuspecting humans being ousted as the world's most powerful creatures by a collective of chimpanzees, gorillas and orangutans who go on to build their own civilization. The original film had one strong female character, but in the 2014 installment, Cornelia, the most visible female chimpanzee and the wife of ape protagonist Caesar, is on screen for no longer than a few minutes. What's more, she's a bundle of gendered stereotypes. After the revolution, she rapidly transforms into a caregiver and companion. As Saini believed, the thrill of science fiction should be its license to break with convention, and it appears even our fantasies have limits. In reality, Saini spoke to Amy Parrish, a primatologist from the University of Southern California, who had studied bonobo apes at California's San Diego Zoo for so long that the animals recognized her. She explained to Saini that male bonobos usually rely on their mothers for protection and status. Without his mother around, a bonobo could fall immediate victim to a violent attack from an older female. Bonobo females are known to chase and attack males. And this matters to the human story because bonobos are at least as close to us in evolutionary terms as chimpanzees are, making them one of our two nearest genetic relatives in the animal kingdom. Naturalist Charles Darwin thought that man has ultimately become superior to woman as a result of evolution. Biologist Edward O. Wilson wrote in 1975 that one of the basic human patterns was that adult males are dominant over females. It's a belief that plays out again and again in popular culture. But we've seen otherwise with bonobos. Primatologist Franz de Waal explains when animal researchers talk about male dominance, they're almost always referring to males trying to assert dominance over each other, not over females. Even in a chimp society where males dominate, you have female leaders, he says. One of the strengths of Saini's book is that she does not shy away from challenging conventional wisdom. She argues that many of the assumptions we make about patriarchy are based on outdated stereotypes and myths. For example, she challenges the idea that patriarchy is a natural or inevitable part of human society. She points out that there are many societies that have been matriarchal, and that even in societies that are patriarchal, there is a great deal of variation in the way that gender roles are defined. In Kerala, India, women's literary rates have been around the same as men's for as long as records have been kept. They currently sit at more than 95%. Running along India's verdant southwest coast, the state is famous for being one where women can travel alone and walk the streets relatively safe and unbothered, unlike its northern neighbours. To this day, Kerala is often referred to by outsiders as matriarchal. In reality, misogyny and abuse exist there just like anywhere else, and women are far from holding all the power, especially lower caste women. But there is some truth to the legends. At least some of the state's record on gender equality can be laid at the door of the ancient Nayars, a powerful caste-based community that once dominated parts of this region, organizing itself along matrilineal lines, tracing ancestry through mothers rather than fathers. They're often treated as exceptions, but societies with a matrilineal bias are in fact dotted across Asia, parts of North and South America, and a wide matrilineal belt stretching through the middle of Africa. Matrilineal doesn't guarantee that women are better treated, or that men won't be in positions of power and authority, but it is one part of the picture of how a society thinks about gender. At its simplest, it tells children that their female ancestors matter, that girls have an important place in their families. It can also determine a woman's status and how much wealth and property she can expect to inherit. In 2020, the economist Sarah Lowes at the University of California, San Diego, published a survey of more than 600 people living in an urban area along Africa's matrilineal belt in Kananga, Democratic Republic of Congo, comparing their responses to independent demographic and health surveys across the country as a whole. She found that matrilineal women report greater autonomy in decision-making, are less supportive of domestic violence, and crucially, experience less domestic violence. Matrilocality, where people stay with or near their mothers' families throughout their lives, often goes hand in hand with matrilineal. And at least some of these matrilocal societies are believed to be thousands of years old. In 2009, biologists and anthropologists writing in the scientific journal Proceedings of the Royal Society B used genetic evidence together with cultural data and family trees to prove that matrilocal communities in the Pacific, for example, may go as far back as 5 millennia. There's also a local saying in the million-strong Khasi community in the grassy hills of Meghalaya, northeast India, which says all people sprang from women. Khasis are matrilineal, but unlike Kerala's Nayars, their tribal society remains matrilineal to this day. A child is seen to belong to her mother. She in turn belongs to her own mother, and so on, all the way back to the root ancestress. The birth of a daughter is cause for celebration because there's nobody to carry on the family line without her. Hence, the most dangerous part of any form of oppression is that it can make people believe that there are no alternatives. She also explores the ways in which patriarchy has been used to justify inequality and oppression, and how it continues to shape our world today. The anthropologist Adam Cooper, whose work has shown how the idea of primitive societies was invented, told Saini that Europeans believed that Native Americans, like indigenous people everywhere, belonged to the past and that they were lower down the chain of development, closer to a primordial state. If humanity was advancing from savagery to civilization, then Western Europe was at the peak of this ladder of progress. Everyone else was on the lower rungs. In this worldview, it wasn't just certain races that were overtaking others, it was also men who were taking their place as the dominant sex. Where women were closer to nature, men were seen as closer to rationalism as part of a so-called Enlightenment period. Unfortunately, this was the bedrock of how the US was founded. Saini draws on a wide range of sources, including archaeological evidence, historical texts, and interviews with experts in the field. In the ancient Turkish metropolis and ruins of Çatalhöyük, we see some of the first glimpses of human civilization. What makes Çatalhöyük special is that it was occupied after the end of the Old Stone Age, from at least 7,400 BCE, in a period of time called the Neolithic, before humans are known to have begun writing. This means it was occupied almost 5,000 years before the first pyramids went up in Egypt, and more than 4,000 years before Stonehenge was built in Britain. Experts believe that there may have been a cult of ancestor worship at Çatalhöyük. The hall of sculptures at many Neolithic sites from this region, and even further afield, is unmistakably heavy with what look to be curved female forms. One has the torso of a pregnant woman on one side and the protruding ribcage of a skeleton on her back. None of these finds, though, is quite as remarkable as the seated woman. As a result, there is a large amount of fascination, and the area traditionally worshipped goddesses. It was the late British-Dutch archaeologist James Meerlaat who was the first to ignite the matriarchal legends that continue to swirl around Çatalhöyük to this day. As far as Meerlaat was concerned, Çatalhöyük provided hard archaeological evidence for their theory that the earliest human societies placed women at their centre, worshipping goddesses and following matrilineal systems of inheritance. In her popular 1976 book, the Paradise Papers, the art historian and sculptor Merlin Stone said that the great goddess, the divine ancestress, has been worshipped from the beginning of the Neolithic from 7000 BCE until the closing of the last goddess temples in roughly 500 CE. There were records of goddesses in Sumer, Babylon, Egypt, Africa, Australia, and China. Ancient Greek society would become deeply skewed in favour of men. Its literature, philosophy, science, and art would reflect a civilization more hierarchical than had arguably ever been seen before. Whatever brought about this social shift, whether it was a cultural interaction, proselytization, forceful coercion, environmental change, social disruption, seeded by a small number of people, or some combination of factors, a certain form of gendered oppression was gradually established in Europe and parts of Asia. The already powerful would further consolidate their power. Saini also challenges the idea that patriarchy is always bad for women. She points out that there have been some benefits to patriarchy, such as the development of agriculture and the rise of civilization. However, she also argues that the costs of patriarchy have outweighed the benefits. She points out that patriarchy has been used to justify inequality and oppression, and that it has had a negative impact on the lives of women throughout history. After the start of classical antiquity in this part of the world, around 800 BCE, male domination would become the social norm. Neighbouring Athenians saw courage as a firmly masculine quality to be prized only in men. A cowardly man in Athens might be described as effeminate. In Sparta, courage wasn't gendered this way. Spartan cowards were not compared to or called women because Spartan women were not perceived as lacking in courage. Walter Penrose, a historian of gender and sexuality in the ancient world at San Diego State University, explains. In ancient Eurasia, says Penrose, there is archaeological evidence of women buried with weapons among ancient Scythians, Sarmatians, and Thracians. These real women warriors, if that's what they were, may have been the inspiration for the Greek legends of warrior Amazons. Clearly, women fought in these societies. Decades ago, a realization animated the work of anti-colonial theorist and psychiatrist Frantz Fanon. I am not a prisoner of history. I should not seek, therefore, the meaning of my destiny, he wrote in his book, Black Skin, White Masks. As far back as we can see, humans have landed on rainbows of different ways of organizing themselves, always negotiating the rules around gender and its meaning. Nothing was static. Over millennia, though, we've been pushed gradually into believing that there are just a few ways in which humans can live, to the point where we now feel that the social patterns we follow must be natural rather than man-made. Our final book is from writer, speaker, feminist, and women's pleasure activist Jaclyn Friedman with Unscrewed, Women, Sex, Power, and How to Stop Letting the System Screw Us All. Her best-selling book, Yes Mean Yes, Visions of Female Sexual Power and a World Without Rape, was a major contributor to the Yes Mean Yes standard of sexual consent, which is currently used on many US college campuses. Here she is speaking to the Laura Flanders Show.
Time's up. None of that stuff's helped. I mean, it has absolutely been a wonderful momentum. And the book was coming out literally in the height of Me Too. Obviously, I wrote it before then because that's how these things work. And I think that the Me Too conversation has been great. It's been long overdue. But we're in a time of profound backlash, and there's no pussyfooting around that. Faux empowerment is the idea that women can decide our way free, right? That if we take a pole dancing class or buy the right lipstick or, just decide we're badass, free sexual women, that's all that it really takes. Now, I'm all for that stuff if people want to do it because I'm for people doing things they enjoy. But faux empowerment is an individualistic solution to a structural problem. And so one of the examples I give in my book that really illustrates the phenomenon is the story of a woman who had a lot of body image issues. She didn't like how she looked. She was really suffering over it. And a friend of hers suggested, you should go do a boudoir shoot, right? You should get sexy photos taken of yourself. You'll see how beautiful you are. You'll feel better. And she did it. And it worked, right? And she saw the picture and she was like, wow, I actually am pretty sexy. And she showed them to her boyfriend and she felt better. And the faux empowerment story usually stops there, right? Hooray, this one woman did this thing that happened to involve capitalism, which faux empowerment usually does. It's usually selling us something. And she felt better. There's no need for structural change. But what happened after that is they broke up. He was very angry that he no longer had access to this woman anymore. And he released those photos without her consent all over the internet. And she was deluged with rape and death threats. And so as much as I'm all for people doing things that make them feel better on an individual level, we have to stop falling for the idea that that's actual power.
We still live in a society that routinely demeans women and robs them of their right to control their bodies. And when women are sexually assaulted or attacked, it's all too common for them to be blamed by authorities and the public. While these things can happen to any woman in America, there is an especially troubling history of mistreatment and dehumanization of women from minority groups. They continue to be the most vulnerable to violence. Native American women in particular have a long history of being characterized as inhuman savages, even by certain church leaders. It's likely a significant reason why this group has experienced the highest rate of rape in the United States, with 49% having suffered instances of sexual violence. Black women are another group with a long history of dehumanization. For centuries following America's foundation on chattel slavery, Black women were treated more as animals than humans, as if they needed taming by white men. This disturbing perception has been used to justify countless crimes of rape and abuse, even until our present day, where Black women suffer disproportionate injustice. Even though only 14% of all girls in the United States are Black, in juvenile prisons, 33% of them are girls, making them targets for arrest unlike their white counterparts. At the heart of this violence lies the way society views people. When we see them as different from other human beings, our empathy for them decreases and we are able to treat them differently than we would expect to be treated ourselves. The author says fake empowerment is keeping women from truly achieving power. One of the biggest trends these days is what she called forpowerment, which is the popular yet phony idea that modern women are completely free and liberated. Sure, some women can be open and public about their sexuality, but this is only a distraction from the underlying misogyny and old-fashioned attitudes that continue to reign supreme amongst the powers that be. Friedman highlights this in popular culture. Hugh Hefner, founder of the Playboy magazine, often called himself a feminist and liked to point out how much money he gave to pro-choice causes. But his magazine was strict in only featuring women who fitted Hefner's idea of the girl next door, which excluded any women who might have had an unwholesome or assertive ideas about their sexuality, or who might challenge the traditional male-dominated relationship. The Spice Girls were another prime example of a male-manufactured concept of female empowerment. The group was created by manager Simon Fuller, who developed a cheeky, sexy message that would appeal to young girls while being completely inoffensive to male sensibilities. While naive teenagers might have viewed the Spice Girls as cool and feisty women, they were just distracting their generation from the reality that gender equality meant more than singing catchy tunes and dancing on tables. The media in particular uses female sexuality to present women purely as objects of male sexual desire, rather than human beings with their own emotional lives. All too often, women appear in films and television programs for the sole purpose of being a sexual conquest for the male protagonist. And all this does is further obscure the fact that women are intelligent, emotional, and complex human beings. To see how damaging this constant misrepresentation is, an experiment was conducted in which female participants were asked to solve math problems while first wearing normal clothes and then wearing a swimsuit. As you might suspect, the participants scored worse when wearing the swimsuits, and the researchers concluded that women find it difficult to be their intelligent selves when they are made to feel like sex objects. Some feminists believe it's appropriate to cast shame upon women who work in industries where they are sexualized, such as the porn business. In some instances, the feminists will assume that these women are too dumb to understand what they're doing and what it means. But what these feminists fail to consider is that a woman might have personal reasons for choosing such a profession, and that they might find it empowering to explore their sexuality. The difference between a woman deciding to be openly sexual and a woman who is being sexualized depends a lot upon the context and intention of the situation. It is important not to jump to conclusions or behave self-righteously and confuse the two. According to Friedman, if we look at things from a biological perspective, women, generally not men, have clitorises, the only part of the human anatomy with the sole purpose of providing pleasure apparently. And contrary to what you might have heard or read elsewhere, women don't need commitment or a certain amount of romance to enjoy sex. Studies show that women are just as attracted to the idea of casual sex as men are, but they have to reckon with the inherent danger of being alone with a stranger and uncertainty over whether that man would give any thought at all to their pleasure. There are very few reference materials available for young women to read, and society doesn't encourage them to feel comfortable about exploring their sexuality. In fact, women who are open about exploring such matters are often made to feel shame. Yet, there are sexualized media images of women everywhere they look, and even the products and advertising content targeted at women are usually made and primarily enjoyed by men. This is often the case with products related to female empowerment. Because while women are supposed to enjoy this representation, it conflicts with their natural instincts about what they want. Now right-wing Christians in the United States have attained too much control over reproductive rights. The modern movement can be traced back to 1976, when the Christian conservative Bob Jones University lost its federal tax-exempt status because it wouldn't allow interracial dating on campus. The evangelical community was immediately outraged by this and began to rally support against government interference. But as they built up some political momentum, they eventually shifted their focus from defending racist policies to condemning abortion. This new right-wing religious faction understood that promoting blatant racism wouldn't get them very far in mainstream politics. But the subject of abortion was another matter. There are enough Republican politicians willing to take up this cause on behalf of evangelical voters that a strong, mutually beneficial political force soon took shape. Even though the United States is supposed to be a shining example of democracy, it is essentially a theocracy, promoting extreme religious values and bullying women who dare to make decisions that are in their best interests. One of the worst pieces of legislation to come out of this theocracy was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. While it was promoted as a law that would protect Americans' right to practice any religion, it actually protects discrimination against those who don't subscribe to the religious rights values. For example, under this act, a Christian pharmacist can legally deny a woman access to emergency contraception. The name of the reproductive justice movement was co-coined by Loretta Ross, a feminist activist with a long track record of fighting for women's rights. As the name suggests, Ross's cause is primarily about winning the right to decide what happens to her body. But it also takes into account the many considerations that influence decisions about starting a family and other factors that affect women's bodies. This includes access to healthcare and the economic circumstances in which a woman might live. Unfortunately, Black women like Ross are quite familiar with being blamed and persecuted for their sexuality. Anyone who comes from a low-income neighborhood knows the injustice of being at the whims of white male politicians who get to decide what kind of healthcare access they'll have and how much funding the social programs in their city or state will get. Reproductive justice is about fighting for women to be taken seriously by the police when they report sexual assault, and for the legal system to take swift action against rapists and sexual predators. It also seeks to end rape culture by eliminating the rampant sexualization and objectification of women. Students in US public schools are supposed to be taught a wide range of subjects to prepare them for adulthood. Somehow, sex, one of the fundamentals of life, goes unmentioned, or worse, gets misrepresented. In many states, sex education isn't a mandatory course. But in states where it is, the class is often focused on teaching abstinence, which means students learn nothing about how to give or receive pleasure and the importance of this in a healthy sex life. So right from the start, girls in particular are being set up to think that bad sex is something they have to endure. And by teaching abstinence over the use of contraceptives, schools are increasing the chances of underage pregnancy. Other nations point to a better way. Some of the world's most comprehensive sex education is being taught in the Netherlands. Unsurprisingly, the country has one of the lowest global rates of teen pregnancy. Like it or not, students also need to learn about rape and consent. This means putting an end to the idea that rape is what happens when a woman is attacked while walking alone at night. The far more likely scenario is being at a college party and getting forced into non-consensual sex. Abstinence teaching also avoids dealing with the major problem women face, the idea that they must limit their freedom and behave a certain way if they hope to be safe. Instead, male students need to be taught that sex isn't something they're owed and can take whenever they feel like it. In this way, sex education could be a powerful tool for ridding society of toxic masculinity. We should be teaching boys that women have an equal right to enjoy sex and instilling a healthy attitude towards female pleasure. Otherwise, young men are bound to learn a different attitude from America's most popular sex educators, the biggest instillers of toxic masculinity, the porn industry. A woman's agency is just as important as a man's, and this is worthy of teaching in school. So to sum up, Saini says in The Patriarchs that division is part of what gives patriarchy its power. The damage wrought by gender depression isn't just economic or physical, it's emotional and psychological. Patriarchy as a single phenomenon doesn't really exist. There are instead, more accurately, many patriarchies formed by threads, subtly woven through different cultures in their own way, working with local power structures and existing systems of inequality. If we're ever to repair the damage caused by patriarchal power, we can only do it by nurturing this shared humanity, the part of us that manages to love even when there are those seeking to divide and rule. Friedman says in Unscrewed that one of the most important issues we face is our need for sexual equality. Society needs to understand that women have a right to control what happens to their body, to explore their sexuality without fear, guilt, or shame, and to hold men accountable for sexual assault. A male-dominated power structure currently ensures that old and discriminatory attitudes are kept in place. So we must topple this system and replace it with one that promotes equality and true empowerment. I was part of the wave of feminists in the 2000s, and I can honestly say there is still so much work to be done to undo the system. It can be one step forward and two steps back at times, and there's no doubt it will take decades to change. Please join in on the conversation by following at HowToBe247 on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and subscribe on the podcast, which can be found via www.howtobe247.com and on the YouTube channel. Please do leave a review if you found this helpful and you want to be featured. Remember to check out Patreon for exclusive unseen bonus material from every single interview, all for a price of a coffee. And don't forget to check out the new website. Before we go, here is Libby Vincent, founder of a feminist leadership consultancy called Hodology, on her thoughts. See you next week.
Let's start by saying we believe that there are natural differences between men and women, that all women are one way and that all men are another. This is how it's meant to be, and that it's important for our survival as a species and a society. Now, let's add to that the belief that in this natural order of things, the behaviors and attributes associated with being a man are the same as those needed by our leaders. The Venn diagram of natural leader and natural man is a circle. This is patriarchy, the foundational beliefs upon which the whole of our society is built. The pairing of these two beliefs and the actions we take as a result. What it looks like every day is twofold. Firstly, that men and women are intrinsically different, which means anyone who doesn't follow the norm for their gender is a risk to society. Feminine men and masculine women, remembering that feminine men are, for example, those which show emotion, and masculine women are those which you aspire to or achieve leadership positions. The fear of being labelled a failed man means in the UK, the biggest killer of men under 45 is the act of taking their own life. For women, positions of power are accompanied by relentless abuse, including death threats and in some cases even murder. Secondly, that men are natural leaders, which has the flip side consequence of labelling women natural followers. If you're not one, then you must be the other. The consequences for women of being labelled a follower is the idea that we can be collected, traded, or lent out, but we can't be shared. The objectification of women is the same mindset that places a higher value on a shiny football sticker. The restriction of bodily autonomy is both an act of ownership and a punishment for women who choose not to commit to one leader, to one owner. It's through these checks and balances of abuse, violence, shame, and legislation that those which believe in the patriarchy protect our society. By keeping everyone in their place, they ensure the future of the foundation beliefs that men and women have innate characteristics and that those that come with a penis are the best for leadership. Is the patriarchy alive today? Sure it is. Look at the suicide rates in young men, look at the eating disorders in young women, look at boardrooms and parliaments all over the Western world. The problem is we're so used to living in a patriarchal society that it feels normal.